The story of Bronislaw Malinowski is one of the greatest tales in anthropology. Almost 100 years ago, his short visit to some remote islands of Papua New Guinea turned into a 4-year odyssey. Here, Malinowski started a revolution in anthropology. He left behind the colonial settlements to live cheek by jowl with the natives. His experience would overturn the Victorian notion of the simple savage and transform the way we look at our own society. But with the publication of his private diaries in 1967, a complex truth about the man began to come out. Who really was Malinowski, and what drove him to become the founder and hero of modern social anthropology? In 1942, at Yale University, some battered notebooks were found on top of a cupboard. They were the private diaries of Bronislaw Malinowski, the man who founded modern social anthropology. For a further 25 years, these diaries were a closely guarded secret, until 1967, when their publication sent shockwaves through the world of anthropology.
His attitude was rather unpleasant and rather superior, and not an ideal model for younger anthropologists.
The diaries from this hero was shown to have feet of clay, to be a lustful, indiscreet, arrogant, lying, racist at times. He was all the things that they wished he wasn't.
The diaries laid bare the dark side of a revered academic figure. This film reveals a man driven close to the edge of reason in his passionate pursuit not only of a new science, but of his own power and prestige. London, 1910. The bustling hub of the British Empire and the greatest city in the world. That March, a poor but well-born young Pole arrived and fell in love.
My Anglomania has become something more akin to a mystic cult, worshipping at the altar of British culture.
Fascinated by England's social structure, Malinowski desired to be part of the upper classes.
I both admire and fear the English way of life. Its elegance and refinement. Indeed, they are the very aristocracy of the nations. A highly superior nation where one is only tolerated if one is amusing.
His surviving daughter and great-grandson bear out his desire for acceptance.
There's a photograph of him at a dinner party, and he's obviously very pleased that he's with Sir Thingamy and Lord Whatnot and the Duchess of Blah, and who's to blame him? No.
Me.
You. Okay, well, you're an American. You can't help yourself.
Without personal wealth to help him on his way, Malinowski would have to rely on the one thing he did have: brains.
I'm determined that I shall be accepted into this aristocracy. The one thing I have to proffer is my extraordinary intellect. It is this that will make me important. I shall be an eminent scholar. Do you think?
His brains took him to the London School of Economics, where he plumped for the little understood subject of anthropology. It means literally the study of man. As the British Empire expanded, it encountered a world of mysterious tribes, cannibals, and curious traditions. The Victorians wanted to find a way of classifying these bizarre and exotic cultures.
Collecting objects was part of that process of making sense of human variety, and the different objects that people made and used were indicative in many ways of the sorts of societies that they had.
To Victorians, the people who made these objects appeared savage. And what's more, these savages performed magic, tattooed their bodies, and even practiced promiscuous sex. Their lifestyle sent decent Victorian folk into a spin of moral panic and terror.
In the popular mind, a savage was someone who was at the mercy of their emotions, wasn't fully in control of their rational thought, and therefore was sort of blown hither and thither by changing emotional forms. Right at the heart of the notion of savagery were both sex and violence, basically.
The study of these savages and everything they did was anthropology. Its experts were respectable gentlemen who considered the savage was best studied from a safe distance.
These were known as armchair anthropologists, people who lived in places like London, Oxford, New York, and either didn't travel very much themselves or didn't travel at all. And what they did was, often by writing letters, was to get a whole series of accounts from travellers and colonial officials, missionaries around the world, about the customs of the people that they were in contact with.
Perusing these reports in their armchairs, they formulated a theory on savage life.
The usual idea was that these people were so-called primitive people. They were more or less equivalent to the most ancient of our own ancestors. And so they must represent something which is the opposite of ourselves. If we are monogamous, they must be promiscuous. If we live in homes, they must be nomadic. If we are rational people believing in all sorts of rational things, they just are completely enthralled to superstition, believing, and so on and so on. So they are the opposite of ourselves, however we imagine ourselves.
Off on the trek into the heart of the Never Never, the expedition is nearing the country inhabited by the real bad men of Australia, wild blacks who have never seen a white, prehistoric beings sprung from a race said to be 500,000 years old.
Savages seem to be a throwback to a prehistoric past, and their primitive societies the relics of man's march towards civilization.
Almost always it was Australian Aboriginal people were seen to be at the bottom of the ladder of evolution, and then there were chiefly societies, people like the Tahitians and so on, who were part way up, and then came the state societies of the Chinese, and then laughable to us a little bit further up were other European nations like the Italians, who are said to be a bit sort of irrational and emotional, and of course right at the pinnacle of evolution were the good old rational thought.
In 1910, when Malinowski began to study anthropology, it was the Australian Aborigines that were under particular scrutiny. Reports told of promiscuity and multiple sexual partners. It was the Aborigines' apparent lack of any family structure that confirmed their place at the base of social evolution. But Malinowski wasn't impressed with this conclusion.
Everyone acquainted with ethnographic information in general, and that of Australia and its Aborigines in particular, knows how ambiguous and confused it is on nearly every point.
Keen to get ahead in his new line of work, Malinowski took a thorough look at all the data on Aboriginal family life.
He looks at all this material, at the Australian material. He looks at censuses. He looks at photographs. He looks at descriptions of who are interacting with whom in the villages.
And his research led him to a radically different conclusion.
He says, well, look, whatever these people are telling you, it's quite clear that they are living in something very much like what we would call families. You have a man with one or two, sometimes three women whom he's living with on a long-term basis, over whom he has more or less exclusive rights of various kinds, including sexual rights. Their children are very close to him. They live together in one or two adjoining huts. They cook together, they eat together. Well, that's a family. Malinowski said, it looks like a family, it talks like it's a family, even if it doesn't call itself a family.
This initial research confirmed his view that anthropology was riddled with prejudices and lacked rigor. Malinowski was one of those who concluded that anthropology needed a strong dose of scientific discipline. And with a degree in maths and physics, he had exactly the right credentials.
The work of scientifically trained observers, like myself, once seriously applied to anthropology, will yield results of surpassing value. So far, it has been done solely by amateurs, and therefore done, on the whole, indifferently.
Not only was Malinowski a scientist, but his peculiarly obsessive personality was ideally suited to the task ahead. Malinowski's life was one long struggle for personal perfection, both mentally and physically.
Particularly from reading the diaries, I thought that he had this really introspective side where he was, I thought his diary, I think he saw it as a tool.
He was a perfectionist for himself.
You know,
Yes.
Yeah.
He wished to make his life perfect if he could.
He meticulously scrutinized every aspect of himself.
With me, the extremism in self-analysis is pathological, and it leads towards a morbid exaggeration.
First, there was his alarmist obsession with health.
He's such a hypochondriac. Pill bottles everywhere. Do you think that comes from being sick as a child?
I think he was a born hypochondriac, perhaps is the wrong word, but it's possible. You know, he's obviously a sensitive being, you know. but
putting it mildly.
Putting it mildly.
His nervous disposition was so extreme that Malinowski relied on the somewhat dubious panacea of the time, regular injections of arsenic. There were also the intricacies of Malinowski's complex mind.
There is a craving in me for the sensational, for the abnormal. I suspect ill of others and imagine dreadful possibilities.
He says on one occasion in his diary is, I have a fear of pointed objects. Stickophobia, I call it. And fur, he didn't like touching fur coats or anything like that. Velvet and anything slippery, mud. Several times a day he'd rub his hands with hot water and soap.
In short, I suffer from a mania of paranoia and persecution. And all this goes hand in hand with my poor health and my bad nerves. Though perhaps the one feeds upon the other.
Malinowski's obsessive analysis of himself, combined with his scientific mind, would make him the man that could change anthropology. By 1914, the more forward-thinking of the profession were keen on their students taking the equivalent of an anthropological gap year. For Malinowski, this consisted of a grand tour of Australia and its remote territories. Leaving behind his beloved mother, he set off on a busy schedule with many stop-offs. After 3 months, Malinowski reached Papua New Guinea. Even today, it is a wild-looking land of jungle, swamp, and mysterious cultures.
Popular imagination, I suppose Papua was a dark, cannibal-ridden, a savage place. I mean, a real redoubt of savages. The government was always saying how difficult it was, to pacify this place. Travel writers were reporting on it as being a rather malaria-ridden, unhealthy place for Europeans, but fascinating with these colourful customs and colourful natives.
This dark place was the essence of all things primitive and a dream come true for the young anthropologist. But being a sickly, self-obsessed hypochondriac, Papua New Guinea was also Malinowski's own private hell.
He knew he was entering into a dangerous place. What worried him, I think, more than anything else, was the heat.
I have a strong fear of the tropics, an abhorrence of heat, sultriness. Overtaxed heart, nervousness. There is a taste in my mouth and a pain behind my eyes. I think I may vomit. If I do, I'm sure it is tuberculosis. Now, perhaps a lack of exercise is at the root of this condition. Or the tinned food. I must get more exercise, especially in the morning and in the evening. Arsenic is indispensable, but I must not exaggerate the quinine. Also a somewhat congested nose and throat. I am beginning to believe the hypothesis that I am about to die.
Malinowski was expected to tour around, studying a number of different tribes. But off the east coast of Papua, on the far-flung archipelago of the Trobriand Islands, he came to a crucial realization. It was an insight that would help him transform anthropology. Early one morning, Malinowski joined the local islanders to watch an ancient custom. The natives had told him that this was a sacred ceremony called yoba. With drums and chants, they send the spirits of their ancestors, called the baloma, back to a sacred afterworld. The natives' reports seem to suggest that yoba was a solemn occasion, which everyone took very seriously. But that's not what Malinowski saw.
The
priest directing the ritual, is on his own in a corner muttering away the prayers and incantations that he's been told, and most of the people are not paying the blind bit of attention to him.
When the Tsakao sang out, everybody just walked off. The only ones left to chase off the Baloma were myself, 5 or 6 urchins, and Ginger, the cook, and very undignified we were too.
They're chattering away, they're laughing, they're looking after their children. And he says there are a whole lot of children woozing around, small boys making a big fuss, terribly overexcited and so on.
Yoba is undoubtedly important, but in its performance it bears no trace of sanctity or solemnity. It was not so much a religious proceeding, it was a party.
The reality he observed bore no relation to the reports he'd heard of natives being in awe of the ancient spirits. It was a critical moment for Malinowski.
I suddenly realized, with astounding clarity, that to understand people you cannot rely upon what they say they do. Instead, you must rely upon yourself, watching and seeing what they do.
You realize that people tell you one thing but do something else, not because they're lying to you, but they're just like a football player who explains you the rules of football to you, but isn't really giving you an insight into how he plays football, or into the tactics and strategy which he probably can't articulate very well, but which he can act out for you and which you can see in action.
Malinowski realized that anthropology's tradition of relying only on what other people say was shockingly flawed. If he was going to fully understand Trobriand culture, he would have to get much closer to native life. So instead of travelling on, Malinowski decided to stay in the Trobriand Islands. He gave up his lodgings with the local colonists and pitched a tent in a village right amongst the natives.
Malinowski decides to come down from the veranda, go into the village and pitch his tent there. And it's so important that, because he wanted to move away from the idea of just having locals come to him to answer his set of questions, a questionnaire framed in terms of his categories, his understandings, his priorities.
Malinowski wasn't just moving in, he would immerse himself in every detail of Trobriand life in order to get to the truth about their native culture.
As the natives see me every day, they stop being interested or alarmed or even self-conscious in my presence. I have become part and parcel of their life, a necessary evil mitigated by regular donations of tobacco. By living with the natives and taking part in village life, I am learning the native's point of view, his relation to life, and thereby his vision of the world.
From now on, Malinowski wouldn't be a mere observer. By learning the local language, he would become a participant observer.
Malinowski was good at participant observation because he was such a determined, dogged character. I think he realized during his fieldwork that this was the way forward, that he had a revolutionary technique on his hands. This is going to change anthropology forever. It's going to set a completely new precedent.
But what he didn't yet realize was that he'd also started his own personal odyssey. Events conspired to make this one of the longest field trips ever. In 1914, World War I broke out. The British Empire was at war with Germany.
And what changes things for Malinowski is this accident of being caught in Australia during World War I. I mean, it's really an extraordinary moment.
With Europe in chaos, his camping trip would last longer than a few months. Apart from the odd trip to Australia, Malinowski now felt abandoned, alone in the jungle, with only the so-called savages for company.
The sun is almost dipping into the perfectly still lagoon. And the woman next door has begun her wailing. And it is also inexpressibly sad in its remoteness and detachment from my life. I am stranded here, far from all that makes life bearable. It is as if I have no place to return to.
But there was an upside. This forced isolation would allow him time to really uncover the truth about Trobriand culture. And soon he was getting very close to the natives indeed.
A pretty, finely built girl walked ahead of me. I watched the muscles of her back. Her figure, her legs, and the beauty of her body, so hidden to us whites, fascinated me. At times, I was sorry I was not a savage and could not possess this little animal.
For a man who prided himself on objective precision in his work, Malinowski's love life was a chaotic shambles.
He would feel great gusts of passion, and he'd be jealous at the slightest hint of any infidelity. Very, very powerful infatuation, schoolboy-like crushes, if you like.
He fell in love with every woman.
I'm always thinking this is the one, yes?
Yeah, I mean, the way he writes about each woman, I'm in, this passion, but then there's, so many of them, just
Which one am I talking about today?
Okay. And at the same time, it's like this mix of being a complete sort of lecherous fool and this romantic, who's really... deeply feels every relationship.
This man, filmed in the 70s, remembered Malinowski's stay in his village. Whatever actually happened, his gusts of passion were met with equal gusts of remorse. Even when visiting Australia, where he had 2 girlfriends, including his fiancée Elsie, he couldn't keep his eyes off a third.
I sat up with one of the older women. She is not stupid, but neither is she cultured. However, I found myself undressing her in my mind and calculating how long it would take me to bed her. In short, I betrayed Elsie in my mind. And as for Mother, I cannot bear to think of her missing me. I am appalled by my lack of moral fiber. My own death would be the best way out of this muddle.
Despite this inner turmoil, his work of participant observation was about to pay off. 6 months after arriving, Malinowski began to study an ancient tradition that really intrigued him. He noted that every few months, islanders would build fleets of elaborately decorated canoes as part of a tradition known as kula. For kula, they set out on voyages, leaving behind friends and family for months at a time. And kula voyages from neighbouring islands would be awaited with great anticipation.
What you would see over the horizon, these tiny, tiny canoes converging until there might be 60 or 80 or possibly 100. You will suddenly see people on the island start going into the sea to meet these canoes. And as the canoes come nearer, the people going into the sea will recognize individuals on the canoes.
Kula visitors were treated to great feasts, attracting hundreds of locals to these celebrations. Particularly striking were the risks the islanders were prepared to take for Kula, as Malinowski himself discovered late one night sailing between islands.
We passed very close by a coral island, the sea smashing against the rocks. The islanders were all shouting, trying to control the craft. I was terrified. I started to think of Elsie, sleeping peacefully, and that I might never see her again. Once, the crews of a whole fleet of Trobriand canoes were captured, killed, and eaten by the inhabitants of unknown villages. And let's not forget the perils of simply sailing these seas. The reefs, sandbanks, and coral rocks waiting to smash the fragile canoes. The horror of it. All in the pursuit of Kula.
These islanders, it seemed, risked everything for Kula. And strangest of all, the reward for these perilous journeys was the exchange of flimsy shell trinkets. Kula was time-consuming and dangerous, all for something that seemed apparently pointless. Malinowski made it his goal to discover what it was about Kula that was worth risking your life for. Over the following months, he explored Kula from every angle. He questioned the locals, watched the rituals, and tried to make sense of it all. Gradually, the secrets of Kula began to unfold.
There is such nonchalance in the men arriving for Kula, and nonchalance in the old men receiving them. They come, they sit on the canoe, they chatter and haggle, give in. I eat my rice and kippers and read my Kipling. We talk some more, and gradually I manage to drag out the information I'm after.
The information that he dragged out of the locals revealed a complex and sophisticated ritual. First, there were the people who took part.
Only important men could actually afford to go on a Kula expedition, partly because this meant commissioning a canoe, so it meant some sort of outlay.
Malinowski soon discovered that Kula was almost exclusive to the tribal chiefs and men of rank. These VIPs were connected by Kula to a social network that reached far beyond the Trobriand Islands. And at the heart of Kula were the shell trinkets.
In order to establish relationships with other people, you have to establish relationships with something. And these valuables are the means through which you establish relationships. And this means that people go on large expeditions to go and fetch valuables from elsewhere. They receive people who bring valuables to them, and the result is if you link up all these relationships, suddenly you find you're in a huge chain of relationships. And this chain of relationships actually spreads across a large island area.
Malinowski uncovered a complex network of Kula exchange, covering 12 island groups spanning 200 miles of ocean. He also discovered why the shell necklaces and bracelets were so highly prized. Each one had a value that came from its unique history as it passed from person to person and from island to island. The value of each object lay in the renown of its former owners.
This is a history of relationships, and what he wants to know is who has had this before. and to whom he's going to, and when he passes it on, his own name will, in a sense, be part of the history of the item.
So these weren't simply shell trinkets. Each chain of shells was a potent symbol of power and prestige. Malinowski's participant observation had revealed that, far from being pointless, Kula played a vital role in Trobriand society, reinforcing the status of the rich and famous.
This is quite a ranked society, and poorer people simply didn't enter into the Kula exchanges. So this was renown and prestige that were there for those who already had renown and prestige. I mean, it sounds familiar, yeah.
And like a trophy won in battle, owning a piece of Kula made you a hero. Living with the natives for 2 years had paid off. Malinowski had revealed that an apparently meaningless native custom was, in reality, significant and crucial to Trobriand society. But his discovery came at some personal cost. On the 11th of June, 1918, after 4 years away from home, Malinowski received bad news. His beloved mother had died.
I do not know how I shall live through the immediate future. My life has changed completely. I am cut adrift. The link between my past and my present is broken. My life will be forever incomplete.
And he stopped writing his diary. He went crying into the bushes. This was a sort of heart of darkness for him.
I am alone. My heart is pierced with grief now that Mother has gone. Everything is now permeated with her. I know I have a void, a black abyss in my soul. All I desire is to die. To go to Mother. To join her in nothingness.
Deliverance came in November 1918. The war was over. Malinowski could at last return to Europe. In 1922, Malinowski published his fieldwork, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. His detailed descriptions revealed a fresh perspective of the natives.
These messages, they might look very different, they might live in a better climate, they might have more interesting sex lives, but they're very like you and me.
Into his world, dominated by class, imperialism, and crude racial stereotypes, Malinowski introduced the radical idea that these savages were, in fact, sophisticated and rational human beings.
The islanders are just like us. Conniving, manipulative, industrious, like any Viennese businessman. And the constitution of the tribe is subject to a strict code of behavior and social niceties, in comparison with which life at the court of Versailles would seem free and easy.
Malinowski's giving you a real, breathing, talking, plausible human being in place of this old stereotype savage who's just the opposite of what you are. And this plausible human being that Malinowski is giving you is not somebody you admire particularly necessarily, I think, any more than you admire your next-door neighbor, but you recognize it. You say, aha, I can see what he's up to. I can understand it. It makes sense to me, because he's rather like me in many ways.
Not only were Trobrianders just like us, but behind the apparent strange native customs, their societies were every bit as complex as our own.
When I returned to Europe, I visited Edinburgh Castle and was shown the crown jewels. The curator told stories about how they'd been worn by this or that king on such and such an occasion. And as I was looking at them and thinking how intrinsically tawdry they were, I had the feeling something similar had been told me of late. And suddenly, there rose before my eyes the image of a native village on coral soil, and of a brown, naked man showing me long red strings and worn-out objects, greasy to the touch. And these Trobriand valuables are cherished and revered in exactly the same way as those crown jewels, purely for the historical sentiment that surrounds them.
And Malinowski went further. Just as cooler shells were equivalent to our crown jewels, acquiring them was equal to our heroic sporting victories. And he believed these cultural similarities applied right across the globe. Shamanism and magic were similar to our grand religions. Maori tattoos were like medals of achievement.
Malinowski was very clever because what he did in a way was he civilized the savage and savaged the civilized. He showed that they weren't irrational, that they just had different cultural rules to ours.
To many, what Malinowski was proposing was nothing short of revolutionary. Humanity was the same the world over. And he thought he could reveal why with a big new idea in anthropology. Malinowski believed that he'd discovered the engine that drove all human cultures, and that engine could be found right at the heart of all of us.
What is the deepest essence of my investigations? The discovery of the native's passions, his motives, his aims, his essential way of thinking. And it is at this point that I am confronted with my own problems. My self-analysis leads me to ask, what is essential in me?
He said that everybody, everywhere, is driven by the same passions. Hunger, fear, vanity, sex. What he began to propose was that all human cultures had a purpose. Every custom could be interpreted as serving a function in society, and that rituals have evolved to satisfy our basic needs. He called his theory functionalism. It could be applied to all societies, however sophisticated or apparently primitive. And when Malinowski's functionalism was applied to our own society, it promised a whole new way of seeing our familiar world. Today, Sophie is 4 years old. She's having a birthday party.
And I said, "Hello, Mr. Elephant."
At first sight, a toddler's birthday party is just about the toddlers. It's all of them having fun, and it's about gift giving.
In fact, there is a deeper social function to Sophie's party.
Look, you've got some sunglasses.
In fact, of course, if you look at it, there's a lot more going on as who's really inviting whom. and there are very clear decisions as to who is being invited on what basis. There's a sense of social obligation. If you have a group of mothers who have been invited to a toddler's party, well, they should feel obliged to invite that toddler back to theirs.
Ready to blow. Blow a bit harder.
Malinowski is pointing out how culturally constituted are so many of the activities and the ways in which we live, which we would otherwise think are just purely natural. It's the way we do things.
By unravelling different cultures, Malinowski had made us reflect more objectively upon ourselves and our own society.
Are we so superior? Are we so different? Don't we just have a large number of cultural rules by which we order our society? It's just that we start off from different premises.
By 1927, only 9 years after leaving the Trobriands, the charismatic young professor was leading his own department at LSE. Brilliant, autocratic and temperamental, Malinowski had a dramatic impact on all those who came under his spell.
People I knew who were his students, all the men, hated him, argued with him, but were obsessed by him. And the women loved him, without exception. All his women students adored him.
He used his influence to revolutionize anthropology.
From now on, Malinowski introduced the new apprenticeship in anthropology. You couldn't be an anthropologist in Britain after Malinowski without going and doing a year or 2 years as a participant observer, learning the language in some pretty exotic part of the world. It became the initiation ceremony without which you were never going to be a professional.
And a whole generation of his disciples spread out across the world, promoting this new anthropology. With his success, Malinowski had finally finished off Victorian anthropology.
After Malinowski, there was no more of the old armchair anthropology in British anthropology. It really was like turning a switch. That was the end of it in Britain.
Kate Fox is a modern-day anthropologist. Like Malinowski, she is a participant observer, relying on total immersion in another culture.
Traditionally, anthropologists are supposed to do their research like Malinowski did, in sort of remote, uncomfortable places with lots of dirt and dysentery and malaria and mud huts and so on. And I have a bit of a problem with that, because I have sort of pathetic, wimpish aversion to all that dirt and dysentery and horrible killer insects and primitive sanitation and so on. I like to do my research in cultures with indoor plumbing, and where you can get a glass of champagne or a decent cup of tea and do a bit of retail therapy when the natives start getting on your nerves, that kind of thing. So Malinowski would not approve. But anyway, participant observation method is the same wherever you use it. And essentially I do, in this culture, exactly what Malinowski was doing in the Trobriand Islands.
For 3 years, Kate visited the horse races, living with the racing tribe. She has faced many of the same problems that Malinowski confronted when he arrived in the Trobriand Islands.
I think everything about this tribe confused me at the beginning. You know, you walk in here through the gates, you don't know what's going on. Everyone is apparently milling about, you know, in no particular, with no structure, no form to it, and you have no idea what's going on.
But certain rules gradually became clear.
The sort of tribal greeting introduction ritual, actually that you find out very quickly. You know, if you go to the races, you'll find it out your first time at the races. I did. The rule is, essentially, the unwritten rule, is that anyone can basically go up to anyone and say, what do you fancy in the next? It's a kind of standard. It's a bit like the English say, oh, nice day, isn't it, or make some comment on the weather, we all know that that's a conversation starter. It's not a sort of request for meteorological data. And when you say to someone at the races, what do you fancy in the 2:30, you're not really asking about the horses in that particular race. You're saying, I'd like to talk to you, will you talk to me? And the response is almost invariably yes.
The more she stayed and watched, the more secrets she discovered. At first, there seemed to be a formal tribal hierarchy. Stewards and officials were the tribal chiefs and elders. They set the rules. Horse trainers, credited with performing miracles if a horse won, were the revered shamans and witch doctors. But she noticed that at the bottom of the pile, the tribal structure didn't quite match what she'd heard from the natives.
People would tell me that jockeys, are a lower rank of citizen because, they touch their caps. When they come in, you'll notice when they come into the parade ring, they touch the cap to the owner and the trainer.
But as Kate was watching the small men in their bright silks, a different picture started to emerge.
You see, I'd been told that jockeys were, kind of servants, that they were the lowest rung of the sort of owner-trainer-jockey hierarchy. But actually, when you watch them come in, they look well aware of their exalted status, and they're sort of twirling their whips and doing this kind of fanfare announcing their arrival. The owners and trainers immediately, all their attention is focused on the jockey. If you look at people's feet, all the feet are always pointing towards the jockey. Feet are the most honest part of our body because we're not aware of what we're signalling, and the owners are kind of leaning down to catch the sort of pearls of wisdom. And actually the jockey is mostly sort of uttering, non-threatening diplomatic platitudes. But his audience is riveted.
Participant observation revealed jockeys were respected and admired, despite the formal racing hierarchy.
In this tribe, they are, if you like, the equivalent of the young warriors, the young braves, a very special elite group.
Although they hold no formal political power, their talents have a higher value than wealth or official authority. 80 years since Malinowski invented participant observation, it still has the power to reveal fresh insights into human culture.
I mean, this is essentially, I think, why Malinowski is right. And you do have to spend a lot of time, because it's not until you've kind of hung out and wandered around, for quite a lot of time before you realise, you start to see the patterns in what's happening in the behaviour. And that there isn't a particular technique for doing that. It's just hanging out. I think someone's called it anthropology or participant observation deep hanging out. And I quite like that term because that's exactly what it is. You're hanging out, but it's a bit more than that.
Participant observation is Malinowski's greatest legacy to anthropology.
You see, I relied not only on what these savages said they did, but on observing exactly what they did. And there lies the essence of my work.
Malinowski's work brought him the status and glory he'd craved for so desperately all his life. And earned him professorships in Britain and America. Bronislaw Malinowski died an establishment figure in 1942, founder and hero of modern social anthropology. Then in 1967 came something that brought Malinowski's reputation into question. His personal diaries were published. The man who'd elevated our understanding of native cultures seemed to be every bit as prejudiced as the Victorian anthropology he'd so criticized.
Last night I looked in vain for the fellows from my boat. And again this morning. Nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, I am driven into a state of white rage and hatred for bronze-colored skin.
Some believe these outbursts severely tarnish Malinowski's reputation.
When I first read the diaries, I was shocked by the attitude that Malinowski reveals. They contain a very damaging picture, I think, still, but particularly at the time, of Malinowski's personality.
On one occasion I made a joke, and one of the bloody niggers made a disapproving remark. How dare he? How dare he talk to me in such a manner? How dare he, a nigger, find something in me to disapprove of?
Why spend your whole life writing books and founding a discipline if you are not interested in the people you're meant to be studying?
Those who support Malinowski point out that it isn't only the natives that he insults.
Another way of looking at it, which is to say, Malinowski is angry at all sorts of people in this book, and very intemperate, about the Australian administrators, about his colleagues, about some of his friends. Everybody is attacked, and above all, about himself. Nobody is criticized more fully and openly and completely than himself. So Malinowski's use of intemperate language is universal.
But perhaps his diaries reveal a truth at the heart of all anthropology. For all his attempts at scientific objectivity, Malinowski was, like every one of us, a prisoner of his own time and culture, with all its prejudices. Malinowski would no doubt be gratified to know that he continues both to intrigue and outrage. But one thing of which he was certain was his great significance and contribution to posterity.
He really did believe that he was prophet of a whole new way of thinking about human beings. He sometimes called it the new humanism. He really did feel this was terribly important for humanity, this new thing. And a lot of his students believed it too. And it was very exciting.
Because of my work, the study of anthropology, so often mistaken for mere hunting after curios, or a ramble through the savage shapes of barbarous custom, crude superstition, anthropology might become one of the most deeply philosophic, enlightening, and elevating disciplines of scientific research.